This is the story of why I left Russia and why I won't live there again. But it's also a story about how Russia once faced westwards and has now aggressively turned against the West. It's the story of how all this led to the current war and will lead to future conflict with Russia to come. I was born in this building in Moscow in 1981. This is me. And even in these dying days of the Soviet Union, it felt like a country out of time. It had the look of the West in the 50s or in the 60s, but this was the 1980s. This is Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party at the time. Gorbachev wanted this period to be a period of renewal for the Soviet project, but in fact it was a period of revolutionary collapse. You could feel the foundations of the state shaking. The state ideology became a mock ideology. Lenin became a joke. Standing in a queue for 2 hours to see Lenin's mummified body, which I did, was also a kind of ironic ritual. There was a new political figure on the scene. I remember scouring the streets of Moscow with Boris Yeltsin Jr., the grandson of Boris Sr., and we were looking for cheap ice cream. And life was tough. There were food shortages, and I remember calling shops and asking if they had butter, cheese, meat, and the answer was no. The only way you could reliably convert money into goods was bribes. There were coupons and there were fights over produce. I remember my dad battling for a bag of potatoes and winning it over, but at the expense of some other people who also tried. Farcically, people used heroic language about obtaining everyday subsistence purchases or finding the right time to stand in the right queue. And here is the biggest myth, that it was cheap in the Soviet Union. But that's not true. Now let's look at this. First, butter. Now, the average salary in the Soviet Union in 1980 was 174 rubles, and a kilo of butter was 3 rubles 50. Let's convert that into the US context today, where the average salary is $56,000 and monthly that's $4,700. That makes butter be $94 a kilo in the Soviet Union. Let's look at sour cream. Sour cream was 6 rubles 80, which makes it $175 US. Coffee beans. Coffee beans cost 45 rubles a kilo, which in 2022 US context is $1,215 a kilo for coffee beans. A color TV was 685 rubles, which is $18,500. A black and white TV in the 1980s was the equivalent of $14,000. And what about this? This is a Zhiguli, a Lada, that's a carbon copy of a 1966 Fiat model, and that cost the equivalent of $151,000, and you couldn't even buy it without being on a 10-year waiting list. Some things were cheap. The cinema was 20 kopecks, so you could go to the cinema 225 times in exchange for a kilo of coffee beans. And a kilo of coffee beans was worth 900 trips on the underground, which only cost 5 kopecks. But some things were changing. Let's talk about this. The West was idealized, irrationally, but understandably. This is what my favorite toy looked like, made from scraps from the military-industrial complex. And these are the toys I wanted, which I could browse in retail catalogs smuggled into the Soviet Union from Germany. Little by little, Western goods began to appear in the Soviet Union. Coca-Cola, Pizza Hut, and Western action movies. In 1988, I saw Die Hard 1. And the apotheosis of this was that in January 1990, McDonald's opened in Russia. And on the first day, I was in that queue. I stood there for 2 hours. I saved up money for a few months, and I had a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke, and it felt and tasted magical. Time stopped, and I had never tasted anything like that in my life. And in 1990, I got my first proper taste of the West. My family was emigrating to Israel. Then followed a flight to Tel Aviv, and I was amazed to see Tel Aviv lit up at night. Soviet cities were dark, and I had never seen so much light before. In the first days in Israel, I went to the market and I started picking off fruit and vegetables rolling on the ground. And immediately the sales folks started giving me lemons and oranges for free. And that amazed me. But even more amazing was just the sheer sense of color that I had not experienced before. In 1994, I moved to England. I've been a British citizen for a quarter of a century, and I'm based in London. At first, I was a bit disappointed as a kid with a utopian idea of the West, that I had to learn that no place in the world was utopia. But now I feel there is a lot to like about England, and particularly London. I like its multiculturalism. I like the parliamentary democracy, even when it's wonky. I like the individualism and freedom, a subject on which I did PhD work and I'm now writing a book. We thought these values might materialize in Russia, but they didn't. So what went wrong and why since I left? In the 90s, there was a feeling of humiliation in Russia. Russia was an empire with missing limbs and diminished global power. And the anarcho-capitalism of the early 90s, though nowhere near as much of a catastrophe as the Bolshevik experiment, still had enormous human costs. Up to 10% of the population was living in malnutrition and deprivation. Between 91 and 1996, consumer prices increased 1.7 thousand times. And in the late 90s, Putin was engineered into power by a committee that put together a candidate to play on these insecurities. That sense of being humiliated and wounded and disregarded was something that Putin played on for 20 years. He showered the population with propaganda that took a real wound but made it much, much worse. The propaganda worked, but something even more disturbing than that happened. The elite began to believe the propaganda that they themselves made up. And that feeling of being inconceivably wounded by the West became sincere, not just in Putin's head, but in everybody else on his Security Council and in his circle.
То есть коллективная власть обиделась на Запад?
Очень сильно обиделась. Обиделась, просто до усрачки обиделась. Ужасно обиделась. Просто как-то, невероятно обиделась.
Today, 32 years after I left, hostility toward the West is way worse than it was under Stalin. Under Stalin, ordinary folks and the politicians hated the American system or the American government, but they didn't hate ordinary Americans or ordinary West Europeans. Well, now they do. In February 2022, Putin decided to risk everything to give Russia a chance of changing its place in the world. So what will happen next? Russia is in trouble. The sanctions will undermine its economic, social, and political infrastructure. Russia's anti-Western course, increasingly fueled by mystical delusions, will continue, and Russia will increasingly lose a sense of reality. This reminds me of a scene from Encounters at the End of the World, a Werner Herzog film, in which Werner spots a penguin marching away from water and away from its colony into the interiority of the vast continent with 5,000 kilometers ahead of it and certain death. We've got to look at what we can do about this. We've got to balance moral outrage at Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine with strategic prudence. To help with this, we need to understand, and understanding requires history. Putin's own historical fantasies start in the 9th century with Prince Volodymyr, and here for Putin is the beginning of true Russian state formation. And then he goes through Peter and Catherine the Great into the Tsars of the 19th century. We have got to explore the continuity with Russian imperialism, with Russian autocracy, with the desire of Russian governments and rulers to be feared. And to do that, watch this video next.